Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm continuing with my exposition of my translation of Acts. We have come now to chapter 21 and verse 1. I will read verses 1 through 6 for the start, just 1 through 6. So after disengaging ourselves from them, we were able to set sail, and running a straight course, we came to Kos, and the next day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. We found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, went on board, and set sail. When we had sighted Cyprus, we passed it on the left, sailed on to Syria, and landed at Tyre, because it was there that the ship was to unload the cargo. Upon finding disciples, we stayed there 7 days. These, through the Spirit, told Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. But when our time was up, as we left to go on our way, they all, including women and children, accompanied us out of the city, and kneeling down on the beach, we prayed. After we had taken our leave of one another, we boarded the ship, and they returned to their homes. Not too much to comment on here, but to remember what the prior context was. The prior context, Paul was in Miletus saying goodbye to the elders, the presbyters who had come over from Ephesus. So the last statement in chapter 20 was, and they accompanied him to the ship. So after disengaging ourselves, that's disengaging themselves from the Ephesian elders, then they were able to get on the board and take off. So they had an uneventful trip all the way to Tyre. Since that was where the ship was going to unload its main cargo, they stayed there 7 days. Now, what I wish to mention here especially is verse 4. These, through the Spirit, that's with a capital S, told Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. Now you remember there have been repeated warnings. Paul himself said to the Ephesian elders, look, every city someone tells me not to go. So here, God plainly says, don't go. And Paul went anyway. It's hard to understand what sort of a mental block may have been in Paul's mind. What would cause him to disobey a plain command? And God told him not to go. Okay, verse 5. I find it very interesting that the women and the children went out to the beach to pray and say goodbye. Luke was there, and he's making a point of mentioning that the children, I take it that those families actively involved their children in their practice of the Christian faith. Now, I say that is an excellent example to follow. Now I will read verses 7 through 9. We're still in chapter 21, of course. Now upon arriving in Ptolemais, the voyage from Tyre ended. So, greeting the brothers, we stayed with them 1 day. Leaving the next day, we came to Caesarea, and entering the house of Philip the evangelist, being one of the 7, we stayed with him. I open a parenthesis here, verse 9. This man had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied, close parenthesis. In verse 8, it's not a big deal. Depending on what version, if you have either the AV or the NKJV, you have we who were Paul's companions. That's based on 13% of the manuscripts. 46% have those who were Paul's companions, but I follow the best line of transmission with 39% and just says we. Doesn't make much difference in this case. Now we know already that Philip's house in Caesarea was sort of like an evangelical inn. People stayed there. It's a standard procedure. And so Paul and company stopped there. Now I frankly don't understand what verse 9 has to do with what is going on. Why does Luke tell us that that Philip had 4 virgin daughters? And why does he mention that they prophesied? I don't understand what this all has to do with the account. Is Luke saying that it's dangerous to marry a prophetess? I don't know, but I find it curious. I don't understand what this is doing here. But of course, I don't have to understand. There it is. Okay, going on. Verses 10 through 14. We're still in Caesarea. Now, as we stayed there a number of days, a certain prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Joining us, he took Paul's belt, bound his feet and hands, and said, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, in this way in Jerusalem the Jews will bind the man who owns this belt and will deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." Well, when we heard these things, both we and the local residents, we kept pleading with him not to go up to Jerusalem. But Paul answered, "What are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he would not be dissuaded, we stopped, saying, "Let the will of the Lord be done." Now, this Agabus we have heard from before. He's been in the account here in Acts before, which means that this Agabus was a known prophet. He had the gift of prophecy. He was recognized. He was known. He was not Johnny-come-lately. He was probably one of the best known and respected prophets at that time. So when he comes along, you should be paying attention. And he is very explicit. He says, Paul is going to be bound this way and handed over to the Gentile. No questions. Well, so of course everyone, oh please, it's on. Now, Paul's answer is simply beside the point. What? He says, "I'm ready not only to be bound, but also to die." So what, Paul? So, this is not the point. God says, don't go. The fact that you're willing to die, that is beside the point. That is not the point. God says not to go. Anyway, Paul could not be dissuaded. He was determined to go, and so the rest says, well, let the will of the Lord be done. What else could they do? They couldn't tie Paul up literally. So that's the way it happened. I suppose maybe they were also hoping that maybe God would just do something to overrule, which, however, he did not. And that brings us now to Jerusalem, verses 15 through 19 for a start. We're still in chapter 21, of course. So after those days, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also went with us, bringing us to a certain Mnason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we were to lodge. And when we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. The next day, Paul, with us, went to see James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he reported one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Now, this brother Mnason obviously was known, and he apparently served as a stopping place for traveling believers. So the believers from Caesarea went with Paul and company to take him and introduce him to this chap, so he would know it was all on the up and up. Anyway, that's where they stayed. The next day, Paul with us, Luke makes a point of saying that they all went along, not just Paul. Went to see James. It says here, all the elders were present. To me, this says this was obviously a put-up job, as they were waiting. They were right there, ready and waiting. And they let Paul say what he had to say. Now let's see what happens beginning at verse 20. I will read verses 20 through 25. After listening, they glorified the Lord by saying to him, "You see, brother, how many tens of thousands are the Jews who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to our customs. What then? The assembly will certainly gather, since they will hear that you have come. So do this that we say to you. There are 4 men with us who have taken a vow. Take them and purify yourself with them and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that there is nothing to the things that they have been informed about you. Rather that you yourself are in line, keeping the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written, having judged that they need observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from that offered to idols, from the blood, from anything strangled, and from fornication. We may understand that it was James who did the talking. Okay, let's go back and see what we have here. Verse 20 says, they glorified the Lord. They were just politely listening, but they had their own agenda. I take it that what follows is obviously a put down. They're putting Paul down. There probably were not tens of thousands of believing Jews. I think that was probably a significant exaggeration. And if they were genuine followers of Jesus Christ, they should not have still been bound to Jewish customs. But besides putting Paul in his place, they were imposing a false legalism on him to which he should not have capitulated. But he was disobeying God anyway, just by being there. I just don't understand why Paul should have been concerned to make the Jewish believers happy, since they were obviously off base, as Paul is going to make very clear in his letters. Probably he had written some of that already. Now the charge here in verse 21, it may not even be true. I suspect that was a false charge. I doubt that Paul was spending his time telling the Jews to forsake their customs. That wasn't what he was doing. He was preaching the gospel. Verse 22, the assembly will certainly gather. 2% of the Greek manuscripts of inferior quality omit that, as in most modern versions. Doesn't make that much difference. But what is the point of James saying that this assembly will certainly gather? I don't quite understand that, unless it be that this would be the place for them to complain about Paul. And so the argument from James was that let's forestall any such complaint. You're just going to be a good boy and do things the right way, and so then we can say, you see, it's not true, and so on. But we have here something very serious. It's quite clear that in James' mind there are 2 classes of Christians, Jews and non-Jews. And there's a clear difference in quality. The Jews are obviously in a superior plane to the non-Jews, the Gentiles. This is quite clear. Concerning the Gentiles who believe, we've already written. All they have to do is just these 4 things, which we've already explained chapter 15. Again, verse 25, 2% of the manuscripts, poor quality, omit, observe no such thing. Doesn't make much difference in this case. This is really a very serious business. The doctrine of the church, as expounded in Paul's letters, which we believe to be inspired, is clear that there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. But to James, it was not enough for a Jew to believe into Jesus. Remember in the council back in chapter 15, Peter had been very clear. The Gentiles are saved just the same basis as we are by believing into Jesus. Peter had been very clear about that back there in chapter 15 at the council. But here you have James with a different idea. It is not enough in James' mind for a Jew just to believe into Jesus. He still has to obey the law of Moses and keep the Jewish customs. In other words, James has reverted basically to Judaism. That's what he has done. And unfortunately, this apparently was the prevailing view in Jerusalem and environs. I say that such a view actually represented rebellion against God, what God had revealed. And I say that then came the judgment. Jerusalem was destroyed, but not only Jerusalem was destroyed, but the church there was destroyed. And the Aegean area became the center, the heartland of the church, if you like. For centuries, Jerusalem, Judea, became no more than a backwater on the fringes of the Christian river. Jerusalem just simply stopped being relevant after 70 AD for centuries. I take it that God judged the church in Jerusalem and in the surrounding area in Judea because they had defected from the true gospel, going back to Judaism. Okay, let's come now to what happens to Paul, verses 26 through 29 to begin. We're still in chapter 21. Then Paul took the men and purified himself with them. The next day he entered the temple to give notice of the completion of the days of purification, when the offering would be made for each one of them. Now when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, having seen him in the temple, mobilized a whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place. And not only that, he's even brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." Open parentheses, they had seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Close parenthesis. Just to comment that the fact that in verse 26 says that he had to give notice there in the temple of the completion of the days of purification, thereby these Asian Jews could know exactly what the program was. And so they could be ready when the 7 days were almost ended. That's how come they were able not to let the seventh day go by and miss their chance. They were able to take advantage of that occasion, as they did. Mobilize the crowd and so on. I find it curious that in verse 29, Luke actually tries to give them the benefit of the doubt, gives us an explanation for why they thought that Paul had brought Greeks into the temple, although, of course, he had not done so. Going on, verses 30 through 36. The whole city was aroused, and a mob of people formed. So having seized Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. As they were trying to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison. I didn't read that well, sorry. As they were trying to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. So he immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down among them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came up and took hold of him, that is Paul, commanded that he be bound with 2 chains, and started inquiring who he was and what he had done. Well, some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the uproar, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob, because the crowd kept following and shouting, "Away with him!" Now, really, I have to confess that I don't understand how they did not succeed in killing him unless simply God did not allow it. Because he's surrounded by Jews. There's no one to defend him. They had plenty of time to kill him. Maybe they got in each other's way, but I suspect that God just didn't allow it to happen. I like the commander. The commander here is the Chiliarch. He is commander of 1,000 men. He would be the military commander in Jerusalem. There would not be more than one man of that rank. And Jerusalem was not that big a town. So he did not hide behind his soldiers. I like this guy. He's right up in front. If there's going to be any risk, any danger, he takes it himself. He doesn't hide behind his men. He goes right up and he grabs Paul. Well, of course, when the crowd saw the commander and his, so they stopped and gave way so that the commander could get there. Grabbed him, had him bound with 2 chains. So then he said, okay, what happened? What's going on? The commander speaks Greek, okay? He doesn't speak Hebrew. And the people speak Hebrew, but some of them will have some Greek and so on. So but of course, there was just a confusion, and maybe they didn't all know what it was all about anyway. So the cruel fact is that the commander couldn't get any satisfaction. Some people saying one thing, and just general noise. So he finally says, okay, let's take him back to the barracks. Verse 35, when they reached the stairs, Paul had to be carried. Now look, they didn't manage to kill him, but they'd been beating on him. So probably Paul was pretty bad shape. He was probably weak, not. So the soldiers and also the crowd kept following behind, maybe trying to hit him some more. I don't know. Anyway, the soldiers found it convenient to carry the man up the stairs. And they just keep yelling, hey, away with him, kill him. I find it, how can they be so stirred up? After all, good grief. What had Paul done? He hadn't done anything there in the temple. So I take there must have been some supernatural participation there, some demonic activity in their minds, something. It's altogether too much, if you like. Verse 37 through 40, which brings us to the end of chapter 21. As Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" So he said, "Do you know Greek? Aren't you the Egyptian who some time ago started a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of a not insignificant city. But I beg you, allow me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned to the people with his hand. When there was a great silence, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, you have to understand the poor commander. How is he going to understand the terrible uproar? How is he going to understand how come the Jews were so worked up? How come they wanted to kill this guy? How come they get... how is the poor commander? He probably did not understand Jews very much anyway. How could the poor commander be? This guy, Paul, must have done something really atrocious to get people so worked up. Now, that's the way a Roman would think about it. But of course, he didn't understand how Jews thought. So anyway, he said, well, aren't you the Egyptian, so on and such? Nope, I'm a Jew from Tarsus, so on. And so the man said, okay, go ahead. In the Jewish culture, to signal with the hand, you were asking, I'm going to make an important proclamation, so this was something so Paul did, and of course they understood what he was saying. So they became quiet. There was a great silence. And he starts talking in Hebrew, which of course the commander does not understand, all right? Commander does not, so he's not going to understand anything that Paul says.